My three sweet alien neighbors entered mating season. Then this happened. HFY Story. The title of the video flashed across the screen. The words bold and dramatic. It was just the kind of content Max had started seeing more of lately. But little did he know, his own life was about to mirror the title more closely than he could have ever imagined. Max had been living in his small, comfortable apartment on the edge of the city for a couple of years now. It was a quiet, unassuming building with mostly elderly tenants or young professionals who kept to themselves. His life, for the most part, was simple. He worked from home as a freelance software developer, met up with a few friends on weekends, and filled the rest of his time with books, movies, and long walks around the nearby park. There was nothing particularly thrilling about his routine, and honestly, he preferred it that way. But all of that changed the day the new neighbors moved in. It had been a quiet Tuesday morning when he first noticed the moving truck parked outside the building. Curious, Max glanced through the window and saw three tall figures, moving with a fluid grace that immediately struck him as unusual. He couldn't quite make out their features from the distance, but something about them seemed otherworldly. He brushed it off at first, thinking perhaps they were simply elegant people, tall and lean, with an uncanny ability to make even carrying furniture look effortless. As the day went on, he couldn't help but steal glances out the window every now and then, watching the trio carry boxes and furniture into the apartment directly across from his. It wasn't until late afternoon, as he stepped out to get his mail, that he got his first real look at them. The three women were standing by the entrance, speaking softly to each other. Max froze for a moment, the air around them almost seeming to shimmer as they moved. Their skin was a soft, iridescent hue, shifting between shades of silver and pale blue under the sunlight. On their hair, long and flowing, cascaded down their backs in waves of silver and lavender. But it was their eyes that truly caught Max at 10. Large, almond-shaped, and luminous with pupils that shimmered like liquid stars. They were unlike anyone Max had ever seen before. Alien, that was the only word that came to his mind, though he could hardly believe it. He'd heard rumors about extraterrestrials living quietly among humans, integrating into society as part of various diplomatic exchanges. But he had never seen anything like this up close. And now, three of them were living just a few steps away from his own front door. Over the next few days, Max became hyper-aware of his new neighbors. Every sound from the hallway, every footstep outside his door, made him wonder what they were doing, who they really were. He could hear them sometimes through the thin walls of the apartment building, speaking in a language he didn't understand. Their voices melodic and soft, like a song carried on the wind. They didn't seem to interact much with the other tenants, and for the most part, they kept to themselves. But Max's curiosity only grew. There was an energy in the air whenever they were near, a kind of pull that he couldn't quite explain. He would catch glimpses of them in the hallway, exchanging quiet words with each other as they came and went, their presence always making the air feel charged, almost electric. The one thing he couldn't shake was how strikingly beautiful they were. Each of the women possessed a different, distinct beauty. One of them, with her deep violet eyes and tall, regal stature, exuded an aura of authority. She moved with a confidence that suggested she was the leader of the trio. Another had a softer presence, her sea-green eyes and gentle features giving her a more approachable, almost serene quality. The third was the smallest of the three, though no less captivating, with bright, golden eyes that seemed to sparkle with mischief. Max found himself thinking about them more and more, even though they'd exchanged no more than a few polite nods in passing. There was something about their presence that felt significant, as if their arrival was the beginning of something much larger than just three new neighbors moving in. He couldn't help but wonder what had brought them here, why they had chosen this quiet little building, and, more selfishly, what they thought of him. One evening, as Max sat in his apartment, working on a project, he heard a soft knock on his door. His heart skipped a beat. When he opened it, there they were, the three alien women standing in the hallway, their luminous eyes fixed on him. The leader of the group, the one with violet eyes, offered him a small smile. "We thought it was time to introduce ourselves," she said, her voice smooth and melodic. "I am Alira, and these are my sisters, Saphira and Tyra." Max blinked, momentarily at a loss for words. "It's nice to meet you," He finally managed, his voice sounding far more awkward than he'd intended. "I'm Max." Allure smiled again, and for a moment, the world seemed to narrow down to just the four of them standing there in the quiet hallway. "We're not from here," she said, her eyes searching his, as if trying to gauge his reaction. "I figured," Max replied, trying to keep his voice steady. He didn't know how to react to the fact that he was now talking to three extraterrestrials in his own apartment building. Part of him wanted to ask 1,000 questions, but another part of him was too stunned to even know where to start. "We hope we haven't disturbed you," Saphira added, her soft voice calming some of Max's racing thoughts. "It's been a big transition for us, too." No, not at all," Max said quickly. "I was just curious about you. I mean, it's not every day you get new neighbors, especially ones who..." He trailed off, unsure how to finish that sentence without sounding ridiculous. Tyra, the one with golden eyes, let out a quiet laugh, her gaze twinkling with amusement. "We understand," she said. "It must be strange for you." Max nodded, feeling his cheeks warm slightly under her gaze. "A little, yeah." After a brief exchange of pleasantries, the women excused themselves, and Max closed the door, his heart still pounding. He leaned back against the door, trying to process everything that had just happened. They were friendly, certainly, but there was something else. A tension in the air, something unsaid that lingered between. As the days passed, Max continued to notice the energy around his new neighbors shifting. It was subtle at first, a quiet intensity in their presence that seemed to grow each time he saw them. The more time they spent around each other, the more Max felt drawn to them, particularly to Allure. There was something about her, something magnetic, that made it difficult for him to focus on anything else when she was near. Then came a night when things took a decidedly unexpected turn. Max had been lying in bed, trying to sleep, when he heard a soft knock at his door. It was late, far later than anyone usually knocked, and for a moment, he thought he might have imagined it. But the knock came again, more insistent this time. He opened the door to find Allure standing there, her expression unreadable. The hallway lights cast a soft glow over her features, making her look even more ethereal than usual. She stepped inside without a word, and Max closed the door behind her, his pulse quick. There was something different about her tonight, something more intense, more urgent. She looked at him with those luminous violet eyes, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. "We're entering our mating cycle," she finally said, her voice quiet but steady. "And it's difficult to control the effects it has on us." Max blinked, not entirely sure he'd heard her correctly. "Mating cycle?" he echoed, his voice barely above a whisper. Allure nodded, stepping closer. "It's part of our biology," she explained, her eyes locking onto his. "We didn't expect to be affected by it so strongly here," but Max's mind raced, trying to process what she was saying. But the words seemed to blur as she moved closer, her presence overwhelming him. He could feel the heat radiating off her skin, and suddenly the air between them was charged with an intensity that made it hard to breathe. "We don't want to make you uncomfortable," she added, her voice softer now, almost hesitant. "But we can't deny what's happening." Max's heart pounded in his chest. He could feel the pull, the undeniable attraction that had been simmering between them since the day they met. It was as if everything in the universe had conspired to bring them to this moment. And now that they were here, there was no turning back. Whatever happened next, Max knew one thing for certain. His life would never be the same again. The tension in the air had been building for weeks, an invisible force that seemed to linger between Max and his three new neighbors. It was subtle at first, an almost imperceptible shift in the way they moved around him, the way their gazes lingered a little too long, or how their presence seemed to fill the room in ways Max couldn't quite understand. The sensation grew stronger every day, like a quiet hum in the background of his life, always there, always present, but never spoken of. Max was no stranger to attraction. He'd felt it before in the usual, human way. Brief flutters of infatuation, the nervous energy of a first date, the excitement of possibility. But this was different. It wasn't just a physical pull. It was something deeper, something he couldn't explain even to himself. The three alien women, Allure, Saphira, and Tyra, had woven themselves into the fabric of his daily life. and with them came a tension that seemed to tighten with every passing moment. He would catch them watching him sometimes, their large luminous eyes betraying an emotion he couldn't quite place. It wasn't just curiosity. It was something far more intense, something that made the air around them feel charged, like static electricity before a storm, and yet no words were ever exchanged about it. They continued with their routines, greeting him in the hallway, sharing polite smiles, and offering casual pleasantries. But beneath the surface, there was an undeniable heat, a silent understanding that neither Max nor the women seemed willing to acknowledge. Max's thoughts were consumed by them, particularly by Elvira. She was the leader, or at least that's how it seemed. Her presence was always the strongest, her gaze the most direct. Whenever she looked at him, it was as though she could see right through him, peeling back the layers of his thoughts and emotions with a single glance. There was a power in her eyes, a quiet command that made Max feel both exposed and drawn in, as though he was standing on the edge of something far greater than himself. But it wasn't just Relira. Saphira, with her soft, calming presence, exuded a kind of tranquility that made Max feel at ease, even when the tension between them crackled just beneath the surface. She was gentle in her movements, graceful and serene, but her gaze held an intensity that contradicted her outward calm. And then there was Tyra, the smallest of the three, with her mischievous golden eyes that always seemed to be laughing at some unspoken joke. She was playful, but Max couldn't help but feel the weight of her gaze whenever she looked at him, like she was testing him, daring him to make the first move. They never crossed the line. They never said anything to suggest what was clearly simmering between them. But every interaction was charged with that unspoken attraction, a tension that neither Max nor the women seemed to know how to resolve. And as the days passed, that tension became harder to ignore. Max found himself thinking about them constantly. It was impossible not to. He had never been in a situation like this before. Three incredibly beautiful, otherworldly women living just across the hall. Their presence a constant reminder of the strange new reality he found himself in. He knew he should be cautious, that getting involved with them could complicate things in ways he couldn't predict. And yet he couldn't shake the feeling that something was pulling him toward them, something beyond his control. The attraction was undeniable, but it was more than just physical. There was a connection between them, a silent understanding that went beyond words. Max had never believed in fate, but sometimes, when he was alone in his apartment, he would think about how unlikely it was that they had all ended up here, in this quiet building, living just a few steps away from each other. It was as though the universe had conspired to bring them together, and now that they were here, they couldn't ignore the forces pulling them toward one another. One evening, after a long day of work, Max found himself sitting on the couch, staring blankly at the television. The news droned on in the background, but he wasn't paying attention. His thoughts were elsewhere, on the women across the hall. He hadn't seen them today, but he could feel their presence, as though they were just on the other side of the wall, thinking about him as much as he was thinking about them. A knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. His heart leapt in his chest. It was late, far later than anyone usually visited, and he had a sinking feeling that he knew exactly who it was. He stood up, his pulse quickening as he crossed the room. When he opened the door, Elvira stood there, her violet eyes fixed on him with an intensity that made his breath catch in his throat. She didn't say anything at first. She just looked at him, her gaze searching his, as though she was waiting for him to make the first move. The air between them felt heavy, thick with all the things they hadn't said. Max swallowed, trying to find his voice, but words seemed inadequate in the face of what was happening. He could feel it, the unspoken attraction that had been building for weeks. Finally reaching a tipping point, Allure stepped closer, the soft light from the hallway casting a glow over her iridescent skin. Her movements were slow, deliberate, as though she was giving him time to back away, to stop what was clearly about to happen. But Max didn't move. He couldn't. He was drawn to her, to the intensity of her presence, the way her eyes seemed to pull him in. Max started, but his voice faltered. What could he even say? He didn't know what this was, what it meant. All he knew was that he didn't want it to stop. Allure raised a hand, her fingers brushing lightly against his arm, sending a jolt of electricity through him. It was such a simple gesture, and yet it carried the weight of everything they hadn't said, everything that had been building between them. Max could feel his heart racing, his breath shallow as she stepped even closer, her body now just inches from his. There was no need for words. The connection between them was palpable, a force that neither of them could deny any longer. Max reached up, his hand resting on her arm, his fingers trembling slightly as they made contact with her cool skin. He didn't know what he was doing, didn't know what was going to happen next, but it didn't matter. In that moment, nothing else mattered. For a long time, they stood there in the doorway, the tension between them so thick it was almost suffocating. Max's mind raced, his thoughts a whirlwind of confusion and desire. He had never felt anything like this before. This overwhelming need, this pull towards someone he barely knew, but who felt so familiar, as if they'd been connected long before they ever met. Allura's eyes flickered, and for a moment Max thought he saw something deeper in her gaze, something more vulnerable than the confident exterior she usually projected. It was as though she was letting him see a part of her that she had kept hidden, a part that she hadn't shown to anyone else. And in that moment, Max realized that this wasn't just about attraction. It wasn't just about desire. There was something more between them, something he couldn't fully understand but that he knew was real. The air around them seemed to hum with energy, and Max felt his pulse quicken as Allura leaned in, her lips just inches from his. He could feel the heat of her breath, the way her presence seemed to envelop him, drawing him in until there was nothing else but the two of them standing there, caught in the gravitational pull of something far greater than themselves. And then, just as quickly as it had begun, Allura stepped back, breaking the spell that had held them in place. She looked at him for a moment longer, her expression unreadable, and then she turned and walked away, leaving Max standing in the doorway, his heart pounding in his chest, his mind racing with 1,000 unanswered questions. The unspoken attraction still lingered in the air, a silent promise of what was to come. But for now, Max was left with the overwhelming realization that this was only the beginning, that whatever was happening between them was far from over. As he closed the door behind him, Max knew that his life had changed in ways he couldn't yet comprehend. The connection between him and the three alien women wasn't just physical, it was something deeper, something that went beyond the surface. And now that the tension had finally broken, there was no going back. Max sat down on the edge of his bed, staring at the empty space where Allura had stood just moments ago. The pull he felt toward her, toward all three of them, was undeniable, but it was also terrifying. He didn't know what came next, didn't know how to navigate this strange new world of unspoken emotions and overwhelming attraction. But boundaries between them had begun to blur, and there was no stopping what had already been set in motion. The atmosphere in Max's apartment felt thicker than ever, as if the very air had become a tangible presence that pressed down on him, making it hard to breathe. He wasn't sure when it started, but the tension between him and the three alien women, Allura, Saphira, and Tyra, had been growing steadily over the past few days, intensifying with each passing moment. It was an unspoken thing, lingering just beneath the surface, something that none of them acknowledged but all of them felt. Max had never experienced anything like it before. The invisible lines between them had once seemed clear, and he had been able to navigate the strange allure of his new neighbors with some measure of caution. But now those lines had blurred beyond recognition, and every interaction felt charged with a mix of emotions he couldn't fully comprehend. It wasn't just the way Allura looked at him, her violet eyes flickering with something unspoken every time they crossed paths. It wasn't just the way Saphira's presence seemed to wrap around him like a warm blanket, her quiet, calming energy always present, but increasingly difficult to read. It wasn't even Tyra's mischievous glances, her playful demeanor masking something much deeper that Max couldn't quite put his finger on. It was all of it combined, a steady buildup of tension that had now reached a tipping point. Each day, Max found himself more aware of their every movement, their proximity to him. He could feel the subtle shifts in the air whenever they entered a room, as though their very presence affected the energy around him. The air seemed to crackle with anticipation, the kind that made his skin tingle and his thoughts race, but none of them ever addressed it. No one spoke of the growing strain, of the way their interactions had become fraught with something far more complex than simple neighborly relations. Max often caught himself thinking about what was happening, trying to analyze it, to make sense of it. But the more he thought, the more confused he became. The attraction he felt wasn't just toward one of them. It was toward all of them in different ways, and it was overwhelming. It left him feeling unsteady, unsure of how to proceed. How could he possibly choose between them when each one of them seemed to draw him in with such intensity? Allure, with her confident presence, was always the center of attention. She seemed to radiate authority and mystery, her every glance making Max feel as though she knew things about him that he hadn't yet realized about himself. There was something magnetic about her, a force that pulled him toward her without effort. But that same force also kept him at a distance, as though she was waiting for him to make the first move, to cross some invisible line that had been set between them. Saphira, on the other hand, was softer, more subtle in her approach. She moved with a grace that Max couldn't help but admire, and her presence had a calming effect on him, easing the tension he felt whenever he was around Elira. But even Saphira, with her gentle touch and soothing energy, seemed to be holding something back. It was as if there was a wall between them, one that Max wasn't sure how to break through, and yet he knew that behind her calm exterior, there was a depth of emotion that she hadn't yet revealed. And then there was Tyra, the wild card. Her playful nature often lightened the mood, but Max couldn't shake the feeling that she was testing him, pushing boundaries in a way that was both exhilarating and unsettling. She had a way of making him feel like he was walking a fine line between humor and something far more serious. Her teasing glances and light touches always leaving him wondering what her true intentions were. Of the three, Tara was the most unpredictable, and that unpredictability both intrigued and frightened him. The tension between them wasn't just emotional, it was physical too. Max found himself hyper-aware of every accidental touch, every brush of their fingers against his skin, every moment when they stood a little too close. These moments, though brief, seemed to carry an intensity that was almost unbearable, as though the weight of everything unspoken between them was pressing down on all of them at once. In the evenings when Max was alone in his apartment, the tension seemed to follow him, lingering in the space like an invisible presence that refused to leave. He would lie in bed, staring up at the ceiling, replaying the day's events in his mind, trying to make sense of the growing strain. He thought about the way Elira's eyes lingered on him for just a second too long, the way Saphira's hand had rested lightly on his arm during a casual conversation, the way Tyra's laughter had seemed to hold a hidden meaning. It was as if everything had shifted, as if the very dynamics of their relationships had changed without anyone acknowledging it. The unspoken attraction had now turned into something more, something that none of them seemed to know how to handle. And with that shift came a new sense of urgency, a feeling that something had to give, that the tension building between them was bound to reach a breaking point sooner or later. Max knew that he couldn't continue like this indefinitely. The pressure was mounting, and he could feel it every time he crossed paths with any of them. It was there in the way their gazes met and held, in the way their conversations had become more strained, in the way their silences spoke louder than words. Something had to happen. Something needed to break the tension before it consumed them all. But how could they address it when no one was willing to speak about it? How could they resolve something that none of them seemed to fully understand? Max found himself avoiding long conversations, avoiding being alone with any of them for too long, knowing that the silence would only deepen the strain. And yet, avoiding them only seemed to make it worse. The tension grew heavier with each passing day, until it felt like the very walls of the apartment were closing in on him, trapping him in a situation that had spiraled far beyond his control. The worst part was that Max didn't know what he wanted. Each of them held a piece of his attention, a part of his desire, and he couldn't imagine choosing just one. But the thought of doing nothing, of letting the tension continue to build without resolution, was even more unbearable. He knew that something would have to change soon. The tension had reached a boiling point, and the unspoken emotions that simmered beneath the surface couldn't stay hidden forever. Whether through confrontation, confession, or something else entirely, Max sensed that the delicate balance between them was about to tip, and once it did, there would be no turning back. The weight of the unspoken words and unresolved feelings pressed heavily on his chest, making it difficult to think about anything else. And as the nights grew longer and the days more strained, Max could only wonder how long they could all continue pretending that nothing had changed when, In truth, everything already had. The night was quiet, the kind of stillness that made every sound echo a little too loudly, every breath feel more deliberate. Max sat alone in his dimly lit living room, the glow from the streetlights outside casting long, faint shadows on the walls. He stared out of the window, trying to distract himself from the constant hum of thoughts that had been building in his mind for days. But the tension he had been trying to avoid was creeping into every corner of his life, relentless and inescapable. He couldn't stop thinking about them. Alira, Saphira, and Tyra. Each of them had their own unique pull, and the attraction he felt toward them had been steadily intensifying. No matter how hard he tried to compartmentalize his feelings, they bled into one another, creating a confusing mix of emotions he wasn't equipped to handle. And now, that mixture had reached a point where he knew something was about to break. Max wasn't sure how it had come to this, but he knew one thing. Things couldn't go on the way they had been. The invisible boundaries they had all carefully maintained, the ones that kept their interactions safe and controlled, were crumbling. And now, as he sat there in the half-darkness, he could feel the pull of something deeper, something that was tempting him to cross the line he'd been avoiding for so long. It was a line that, once crossed, would change everything. He shifted uncomfortably on the couch, running a hand through his hair as he let out a slow breath. His thoughts drifted back to the moments that had led him here. The way Alira's eyes lingered on his, full of unspoken promises. The gentle brush of Saphira's hand against his arm, a touch that sent shivers through him. And Tyra, always playful, always teasing, but with a hint of something more that he couldn't ignore. There was a heaviness in the air tonight, a palpable tension that seemed to fill the space around him. It wasn't just the anticipation. It was the knowledge that he was standing on the edge of a decision, one that would alter the course of their relationships forever. And yet, despite the weight of that realization, Max felt himself leaning into it. He wanted to cross that line. The sound of footsteps echoed softly in the hallway outside his door, pulling Max out of his thoughts. He tensed, knowing instinctively who it was before the gentle knock came. His heart raced in his chest as he stood up, walking slowly toward the door. When he opened it, Ayala was standing there, bathed in the soft glow of the hallway lights. She didn't say anything at first. She didn't need to. Her eyes told him everything. There was a quiet intensity in her gaze, a mixture of desire and hesitation that mirrored his own. The silence between them felt heavy, charged with an energy that had been building for too long. Neither of them moved, as if waiting for the other to make the first move, to acknowledge what had been growing between them for weeks. Max stepped aside, allowing her to enter. She moved gracefully, her presence filling the room in a way that made the air feel electric. He could feel the tension rising with every passing second. The unspoken attraction that had been simmering just beneath the surface, now pressing down on them, impossible to ignore. They sat on opposite ends of the couch, the space between them feeling both too vast and too close. Max could feel his pulse quicken, his breath coming a little shorter as he glanced at her. Her posture was relaxed, but there was a subtle tension in the way she held herself, as if she, too, was wrestling with the weight of the moment. The silence stretched on, thick and oppressive, until finally, without thinking, Max closed the distance between them. It was a small movement, just the shift of his body, his hand resting lightly on hers, but it felt monumental, like the breaking of a dam that had been holding back the flood of emotions between them. Lyra didn't pull away. Instead, she turned to face him, her gaze softening but still intense. Max could feel the heat radiating from her, the tension that had been building between them now almost unbearable. His heart pounded in his chest as his hand tightened around hers, the line they had both been avoiding now fully in view. He leaned closer, their faces now inches apart. The air between them felt heavy, charged with anticipation. Every breath, every movement seemed amplified, as though the world had shrunk to just the two of them in this moment. Alira's eyes flickered, and for a split second, Max hesitated. But then, as if guided by something deeper, something primal, he crossed the line. Their lips met in a soft, tentative kiss, a moment of hesitation giving way to the weight of everything they'd been holding back. The kiss deepened, slow and deliberate, as though they were testing the boundaries of their connection, feeling the tension dissolve into something more. There were no words spoken, no need for explanations. Everything that had been unspoken between them, The attraction, the desire, the longing was now laid bare. Max felt the last remnants of resistance fall away, his mind consumed by the intensity of the moment. As they pulled apart, breathless, Max met Elira's gaze once again. There was no regret in her eyes, no second-guessing what had just happened. Instead, there was a sense of understanding, an acknowledgement that they had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. They sat in the quiet aftermath, the room filled with the echoes of their shared breath. Max knew that nothing would be the same after this. The unspoken tension that had hung between them for so long had finally been broken, and there was no going back. But as he sat there, his hand still resting in hers, Max realized that he didn't want to go back. The line had been crossed, and for the first time in weeks, the weight of indecision that had been pressing down on him lifted, replaced by a new sense of clarity. Whatever happened next, they would face it together. The morning after crossing the line with Alira felt different, but not in the way Max had anticipated. He woke to an unusual stillness in the apartment, the weight of the previous night pressing down on him, both exhilarating and unnerving. His mind was a whirlwind, replaying the kiss, the tension, the way it all seemed inevitable. But now, in the clarity of daylight, that sense of inevitability gave way to something else. The complications came rushing in. Max lay there for a few minutes, staring at the ceiling, trying to make sense of what had happened and what it meant for him and the three women who lived just across the hall. The connection with Elira had been undeniable, but he couldn't ignore the unresolved feelings he had for Saphira and Tyra. The attraction wasn't just between him and Elira. It was more complicated than that, entangled in ways he hadn't fully realized until now. Pulling himself out of bed, Max tried to shake off the confusion, but it clung to him like a shadow. He moved through his morning routine in a haze, his mind never far from the events of the night before. The thought of facing Elira again sent a ripple of anxiety through him, but what troubled him more was the idea of running into Saphira or Tyra. They didn't know what had happened. At least Max hoped they didn't. But the tension between all of them had been building for so long that it seemed impossible to think they hadn't sensed something shifting. They were more perceptive than anyone Max had ever known, each in their own way. And that thought gnawed at him. As the hours passed, Max tried to avoid overthinking, but the feeling of walking a tightrope grew with every passing minute. The walls of the apartment seemed to close in around him. He knew he couldn't avoid them forever. Sooner or later, he would have to face the reality of the situation. But how? What was there to say? He had no answers, no clear path forward. When Max finally stepped out of his apartment that afternoon, he hoped for silence in the hallway, some reprieve from the complexity of it all. But as soon as he crossed the threshold, he saw Saphira waiting outside her door. Her back was turned to him, her long flowing hair catching the soft afternoon light. But the instant he saw her, the knot in his chest tightened. He couldn't look at her without remembering the way her quiet presence had soothed him, the way her every touch seemed to calm the storm inside him. And yet, now that he had crossed the line with Elira, that connection felt fragile. Saphira must have sensed him, because she turned around slowly, her eyes meeting his. The softness he had always felt in her gaze was still there, but there was something else too, something heavier, more knowing. She said nothing, but the silence between them stretched out in an uncomfortable, unspoken acknowledgement that things were not as simple as they once were. Max gave her a small nod, not trusting himself to speak. His guilt bubbled beneath the surface. Had she known all along? Could she feel the shift in him, the new weight he carried? He continued down the hall, each step feeling like it took more effort than it should. When he reached the door to the stairwell, he hesitated for a moment. Glancing back, Saphira hadn't moved, but her eyes lingered on him, as though she were searching for something in him that he couldn't offer right now. The complications only deepened when he encountered Tyra later that evening. She was lounging in the communal garden, her posture casual, but her eyes sharp and observant, as always. Max had never quite known what to make of her. She was a constant enigma, playful and carefree on the surface, but with a depth that often went unspoken. As soon as she spotted him, she gave him one of her trademark grins, one that always made him feel like she was in on some joke he hadn't yet figured out. But today, that grin felt different, as though it hit a question. She didn't say anything directly, But the way she watched him made it clear that she knew something had changed. Max could feel the tension rolling off her in waves, even through her lighthearted demeanor. Was she jealous? Hurt? He couldn't tell, and it made the air between them all the more charged. He wanted to ask her if everything was okay, but the words felt stuck in his throat. The unspoken attraction between them had always been part of their dynamic, a game they played but never fully acknowledged. But now that things had shifted with Elira, that game felt dangerous, like a boundary had been crossed that affected not just Elira but all of them. Tyra leaned back, her gaze narrowing slightly, as if she were sizing him up. For a moment, Max wondered if she would say something, tease him like she usually did, but instead she let the silence between them stretch out, her eyes never leaving his. It was unnerving, and it made Max realize just how deeply entangled he was with all three of them. He left the garden feeling more uncertain than ever. By the time the night fell again, Max found himself alone in his apartment, the weight of the day pressing down on him. Crossing the line with Elira had felt right in the moment, but now he wasn't so sure, and the tension between him and Saphira, the way Tyra's teasing had taken on a new edge. It all pointed to one undeniable truth. There were no simple answers here. Max sat down heavily on his couch, staring at the ceiling, trying to make sense of it all. What had started as a confusing but manageable attraction had now spiraled into something far more complex, as relationships with each of them had become entangled, and no matter how he tried to unravel it, he couldn't see a way forward without hurting someone. And that realization sat heavily in his chest. The first light of dawn filtered through the curtains, casting a soft golden glow across Max's apartment. He sat quietly at the edge of his bed, the stillness of the early morning wrapping around him like a comforting blanket. There was a sense of calm in the air, a fragile peace that he hadn't felt in days, though the weight of everything that had transpired still lingered. The complexities of the past few weeks had reached their peak, and now, in the aftermath of it all, there was a moment of clarity, a pause in the chaos that allowed him to finally breathe. The tension, the unspoken feelings, the confusion that had bound him to Elira, Saphira, and Tyra seemed to settle as though all the uncertainty had drained from the room, leaving only the quiet promise of something new. Max stood up slowly, letting his fingers trace along the wall as he made his way to the window. The sky outside was clear, the first rays of sunlight stretching across the city in soft hues of orange and pink. He hadn't spoken to any of them since the last tension-filled night, but he knew that things couldn't continue the way they had. Something had shifted, not just between him and Elira, but between all of them, and now it was time to face that. The decision to cross the line with Elira had been monumental, but it had also been the catalyst for change. In the days that followed, Max had been forced to confront the reality of his feelings for each of them. The attraction, the tension, it had all been real, but so was the complexity of what lay beneath. He couldn't deny that his connection with Elira had changed something fundamental, not only in their relationship but in the way he saw Saphira and Tyra as well. But now, standing at the window with the sun rising over the city, Max felt a strange sense of acceptance. He didn't have all the answers, not by a long shot, but he knew that something had to give. He could no longer live in the tangled web of conflicting emotions that had defined his relationships with all three women. The time had come for a new beginning. He dressed quickly, pulling on a simple shirt and jeans, his mind focused and clear. Today, he would face them, not with the weight of guilt or confusion hanging over him, but with honesty. Whatever happened next, he would be open about what he felt. No more dancing around the truth. No more letting unspoken tension dictate their lives. Max stepped out of his apartment and into the hallway, the cool air of the morning giving him a sense of resolve. He walked with purpose, his steps steady until he reached their door. For a moment, he hesitated, his hand hovering over the doorbell, but he knew there was no turning back. With a deep breath, he pressed the button. The door opened almost immediately, as though they had been expecting him. Elira stood there, her expression soft but guarded, as if she, too, had been waiting for this moment. Behind her, Saphira and Tyra sat quietly in the living room, their eyes on him, each of them reflecting a different kind of tension. The air between them felt charged, but not in the same way it had before. This was different. This was the beginning of something new. Without a word, Max stepped inside, and Allure closed the door behind him. There was no need for formalities, no need for small talk. They all knew why he was there. The four of them sat down, the silence heavy but not oppressive. Max looked at each of them in turn, his gaze lingering on Lyra for a moment longer. The connection between them was undeniable, and the memory of the night they had shared lingered in the air. But this wasn't just about the two of them. It was about all of them and what came next. Max finally spoke, his voice quiet but steady, breaking the stillness of the room. "I can't keep pretending things are simple," he said, the weight of his words filling the space between them. "They're not. But I care about each of you in ways that are complicated. I don't have all the answers, but I know that something has to change." Lyra's eyes softened, and she gave a small nod. Saphira and Tyra remained silent, their expressions thoughtful, but they didn't interrupt him. Max wasn't sure what he expected them to say, but there was a sense of understanding in the way they looked at him, as though they had been waiting for this conversation as much as he had. "I don't want to hurt anyone," Max continued, his gaze moving between them. "But I also don't want to ignore what's been happening. I need to be honest with all of you, with myself." And the room fell into silence again. But it wasn't the kind of silence that felt heavy with uncertainty. Instead, it was filled with something else. An understanding, a shared recognition that they had all been moving toward this moment for some time. After a few minutes, Allure spoke, her voice quiet but clear. "This doesn't have to be the end," she said, her words holding a kind of wisdom that Max hadn't fully appreciated before. "It can be a beginning." Her words settled over them like a warm breeze, softening the edges of the tension that had filled the room. Max knew she was right. This wasn't the end of anything. It was the start of something new, something that could only happen if they were willing to be honest with one another, to embrace the complexity of their relationships and move forward without fear. Max felt the weight on his shoulders lift slightly, the knot in his chest easing. He didn't know exactly what this new beginning would look like, but he knew one thing for certain: it would be different from everything that had come before. As they sat together in the quiet of the morning, the soft light of the rising sun filtering through the windows, Max felt a sense of peace. Whatever complications lay ahead, they would face them together. This was their new beginning,